Okay, we're recording. Oh, hello everyone, and welcome to this meeting about the Indian farmers' protests with Dr. Indrajit Roy. So obviously, for those of you who aren't familiar, a protest has been ongoing between the Indian government and farmer unions who've demanded that the new market-driven anti-farm laws be repealed. On 26th of January, tens of thousands of farmers protested, colliding with the police, and the protest turned violent. And obviously Indrajit is a great person to talk to about this, given that he's an expert in global development, having spent years in the sector and received an Oxford Research Fellowship to pursue the new future-oriented approaches in the discipline. Since joining the University of York in 2017, he has been working with colleagues to diversify and decolonize the departmental curriculum, and he's also a senior lecturer. So thank you, Indrajit, for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Thanks a lot. I'm flattered with all the introductions, but yes, I'll try and live up to them.
Yeah, well, great. Sorry. But anyway, so just to start off, I think it'd be really great for you to just, give us a bit of a paint a picture of the sources of the conflict. So, what are the government's kind of aims, and why did they, put these laws forward in the first place? And how has the agricultural response taken shape? And in a way, whose skin is in the game on both sides? So how would the laws affect the livelihoods of farmers, and examples of that sort of thing?
Sure. I'll try my best. It is, of course, a very complex picture, and I'll try and keep it simple but not simplistic. So I think at the heart of the protests in India are questions over the role of the state in the economy. And they've really showed up in the agricultural sector. So India, of course, is a hugely agricultural economy, and much of India's agriculture is run by what you might call small farmers. So these are, small scale farmers who own small plots of land and cultivate, products on those plots of land. It's not the sort of old style, what you might call a peasant economy, where people farm for subsistence. So it's not a subsistence economy where people grow what they eat, eat what they grow. They do grow for the market. So there is a market orientation. It's externally oriented in that sense, but people often would cultivate using, a pair of animals, or using their own farm labor, or hire labor from neighboring regions or even far off regions. So it's small scale, but it's not what you would associate with the Middle Ages, with sort of peasant agriculture. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind. Now, because of India's colonial heritage, which, where the rural sector was heavily exploited by the colonial state, independent India insisted that the farmers would be protected from market forces. For those of you who might be familiar, and I don't want to get into that debate, but there has been a great deal of economic historical work which suggests that under colonialism, the agricultural sector was particularly bad hit, and there were lots of famines and other sorts of disasters that the farmers were suffered from time to time. And of course, famine is not a natural disaster alone. It's also caused due to human relations, or the breakdown of them. So independent India was quite clear that to prevent famine, they would have some sort of protections for the agricultural sector. They needed to be protected from the market, and especially the vagaries of the market. And there would be state support for farmer products. So instead of the farmers having to depend entirely on the vagaries of the market, there would be some support by the state for the farmers' produce. There was also the question of setting up state-supported market committees where the farmers would go and sell their produce. So it wouldn't be up to the retailers or the traders to come to the farmers and just buy products, at very low prices. There would be a minimum support price that would be offered to the farmers, and some sort of product market committees would be set up in small towns where the farmers would be encouraged to come and sell their products at that minimal price. There was obviously a lot of therefore there's obviously a lot of state regulation of the agricultural economy. Now, all of this worked, of course, for several decades. It helped India get tide over the immediate sort of crisis after independence. It helped India to attain some sort of food security. And when new technologies were being innovated, in farming and agriculture, the state made some of that technology available to the farmers. But there were also accusations that these places were riddled with corruption. Obviously, the moment you have the state deeply invested in agricultural or any economic sort of activities, there is the real or perceived sort of issue of corruption, petty bureaucrats, seeking rents or taking bribes to make available certain facilities, etc. And therefore, as India tried to liberalize its economy, there was this sense that you should allow the market to play its role in the economy, and bit by bit, the state has tried to deregulate the economy. They hadn't wanted to touch agriculture for the last several decades because it employed so many people, and there was an obvious political backlash that the governments in India have worried about. But obviously, over the last few years, the government thought that it could begin to tinker with agriculture more than they had done before. So in September last year, the present government of India, which has come on the back of a huge electoral majority, began to introduce legislation that would make the market much more of a player in agriculture. They began to deregulate agriculture, as they said, or at least they brought about a legislation to deregulate agriculture. There was talk about the market committees being dismantled, so the farmers would be able to trade directly in the market, which meant that they would be exposed to market fluctuations. And many farmers have protested against this, what they consider to be the rollback of the state and their direct exposure to the markets. Now, whether the legislation is anti-farmer or pro-farmer, obviously, as you can imagine, there's been a huge debate as to whether it's anti-farmer or pro-farmer. Some farmers groups have supported the legislation, so that needs to be recorded. But most farmers, and certainly the ones in the north and the west, who tend to be slightly better off, but also more sort of aware of what their rights are and what their risks are, have been at the forefront of the opposition to this legislation. So that, in a nutshell, well, not a nutshell, a rather large nutshell, is what the issue in India is about.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good kind of summary of that. So building on that, sort of what has the backlash been, and how have they been going about organizing that? And what does that say about, the state of the farming communities in the nation as a whole, in a sense,
Great question. So, like I said, there have been some farmers who have come up in support of the laws and said that, well, it's good to have some market involvement It's nice for farmers to sell to the market. But a large number of farmers' unions have protested these laws. They believe, and I think they're right, that the laws will sort of result in them being more exposed to the vagaries of the market, which is not a great thing at this moment. And whatever may have been the problems with the product market committees, those spaces where the farmers could go and sell their products, at least they were familiar spaces. People could get together, farmers would be able to, work together to, influence prices in their favor. The legislation threatens all of that. So we've had at least 30 farmers unions that have gotten together and launched a protest against the implementation of the laws. They've been mostly concentrated in the northern part of the country, but that's also because Delhi, which is India's capital, is in the north. And so when it comes to organizing protests, it's you can march to Delhi, so to speak. A number of the farmers that have been at the forefront of the protests are from the Punjab region in the northwest of the country, and neighboring states called Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, which I'm going to call UP for short. So it's these three states, Punjab, Haryana, and UP, that have been at the forefront of the farmers' protests. And about 30 farmers' unions got together, mobilized since I think it was November or September, sorry, the laws were passed in September, and from about November, they really got together and staged a march to Delhi. It's been said they laid a siege on Delhi, but of course, that's a dramatic way of putting it. It wasn't that they invaded Delhi, it's their own country after all, but they sort of marched down the highways and they set up protest camps at strategic points just on the outskirts of Delhi in order to make their presence felt. Other workers' unions in India have lent symbolic support to the farmers' protests. So I think in November or December, over 250 million workers, that's some 5 times the population of Britain, struck work in support of the farmers for 24 hours. So it's not just that the farmers' protest has been limited to the farmers. Other workers have also showed their solidarity with the farmers. And even as we speak, several of the farmers' unions have, they've set up shop on the outskirts of Delhi in order to make their protests against the laws felt. They have also entered Delhi from time to time, like you mentioned on the Republic Day, where India traditionally has a sort of armed parade in the heart of the capital. This year, obviously, they sort of had much more scaled down parade, but the farmers also said that they would organize a people's parade through Delhi, where farmers sort of marched as well as rode their tractors through key roads in Delhi, again to show that they were protesting what they consider an unjust law. The farmers are of mixed religious backgrounds, which has been used by the government and its allies to try and sow divisions between them. And I can talk about that a little, if you like, later. But that's just an important point to bear in mind, that the farmers are from the 3 northern states, and they are of Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So in regards to that, who do you think is, the more liberal of the 2 parties, I guess? Because obviously, and I guess the Modi government claims that what it's trying to do is, liberalize the economy, prevent corruption, prevent bureaucracy. But on the other hand, it's it's sort of clamping down on these protests and, you know, briefing against them and, you know, in a way trying to get popular support from the middle classes to kind of, you know, sort of prevent them from happening and prevent those voices from being heard. So in a way, is it the protesters who are standing up for free speech, or, you know, is it instead, or, you know, is the free market, is that the stronger liberal current? And, you know, why is it that the two don't go hand in hand when it comes to the current government response?
You know, I think that is such a fascinating question to ask, and it gets us to really think, or rather rethink, what we mean by liberalism and what that category means. Of course, in the West, where arguably liberal ideas were innovated, but also all across the world, where, you know, some form of liberalism has been, you can use any word you want, appropriated, diffused, imposed, whatever, take your pick. I think it's the usual assumption has been that liberal economics and liberal politics would go hand in hand. An economics that favors the individual, that favors the free market, will necessarily also favor the individual as a political subject, so to speak, and allow them to exercise their freedom of expression, freedom of association, but the freedom to dissent and disagree with the government, which is, of course, a key liberal right. We don't have to necessarily say liberalism is good or bad to note this disjunction that you're pointing out between liberal economics and liberal politics. Um, and of course, I think some of us would argue that um, this disjunction sits at the heart of contemporary political economic ways of accumulation, if you will, and you can recognize the Marxian language here. That it's imperative as governments try and safeguard economic rights of the privileged, or the capitalists, or those who are sort of sit at the top of the economy. Of course, they're going to clamp down on the right to dissent and the right to protest. The contemporary forms of capitalism have spawned such inequalities that there is bound to be a reaction to it, which usually takes the forms of protests, and governments don't like that. Even if you don't adhere to a Marxian interpretation, even if you sort of want to adhere to a liberal interpretation, you cannot miss this contradiction between economics and politics. Um, and I think it gets you to think about what really liberalism means. Liberalism could be, in the economic sense, it's about free markets. It's about the individual right to liberty and property, and to do things to operate in the economy as a free subject. Um, and that is all fine. It As long as it doesn't sort of disrupt the apple cart too much. And I think what we see now is that liberal economic liberal sorry what we see now is that you have governments becoming more and more um, unsympathetic to the political dimension of liberalism, while being quite happy with the economic dimension of liberalism. I'm not sure this is a uniquely Indian sort of problem. I think you see this as a problem across the world. You see this as a problem not only in the BRICS, in the Chinas and the Brazils, where you have, of course, economic liberalization going hand in hand with political illiberalization. You also see this arguably in the West. You see this in this country, in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere, where the right to protest is coming under more and more of a cloud. Free speech is increasingly being questioned. and certain sorts of criticisms are allowed, whereas others are sort of clamped down. So I think what you're seeing in India is, in some ways, it's a symptom of a global problem. I don't think India is exceptional in it, but of course in India, the contradictions, the disjunction has sort of exploded, and it's out in the open. What has caused it? As I said, you have our liberal colleagues who would say it's a basic misunderstanding of the government, how the government sees the role, its own role, and the role of the economy. And you have our Marxian colleagues who would say, well, this is the nature of late capitalism, if you will. This is what happens when you allow the market to run amok.
Yeah, I guess in a way that is the central debate of a lot of the economic issues going on around the world right now, is to do with, the contradictions of, the free market and the apparently negative associations that it has. And obviously you were talking about how the centralized kind of farming bodies that currently have been adjudicating, the way in which goods are sold and slightly protecting the Indian farming sector from the market, they're quite corrupt. So do you think a solution could lie in reforming those, or, in a way, using those institutions, but in a different way? Is there any way to fight that corruption, or is that sort of part of the parcel with these kinds of bodies?
Of course, there's a way of fighting the corruption. And I think some colleagues would say that the farm laws are actually perfectly reasonable. And the problem is not so much in the laws themselves, but in the way in which they have been sought to be imposed, steamrolled over the population. And I think that's exactly what shows what the problem is. Had the laws been debated properly in India's parliament, where of course the government has a huge majority. Despite that huge majority, they didn't want to debate it properly. They ran it by what's called a voice vote, where you don't even count the votes, but you just sort of ask for who's in favor, and then if you can shout loudly, then you've had it. The ayes have it, so to speak. So they didn't even bother to have a proper debate or discussion. Certainly, they didn't bother to have consultations. And I think we would not be wrong to say that the farmers' protests may not be so much over the content of the laws, but over the way in which, the process in which these laws have been sought to be thrust down our throats. And that links back, of course, to the question you asked earlier about, who really is a liberal, and what is a liberal. And in that respect, I think the farmers are the genuine liberals more than the free marketeers, because all the farmers want is consultation. All they want is that for the government to, and its appropriate sort of appointees to come and consult with the farmers' bodies and to take them into confidence. I have no doubt that if the laws, the reforms are properly implemented, they may result in improved agricultural outcomes, and they may even result in improved lives of the farmers. That doesn't mean that the existing system cannot be reformed. Of course it can, and you can sort of hold the bureaucrats to account, so to speak, so that they're not as corrupt as they could, as they are. So I think there are several options before the government. They could have reformed the existing very statist sort of paraphernalia that operates by reducing the arbitrary role that bureaucrats often play. They could have brought about the new reforms, the proposed reforms, with a lot of consultation. So either option was fine. I think what the government instead tried to do was to push it down, push down the reforms down people's throats, thinking that the electoral majority they won in 2019 was enough for them to do this. I think they forget that, well, liberalism is about, it's fundamentally a relationship between the state and its citizens. And it's about citizens feeling that they are being consulted and that they have a role in decision making. I think that's key.
Yeah. No, I think that, yeah, that really is the heart of the issue. isn't it? Is the fact that, they didn't consult people, and they didn't, yeah, in a way that could have happened, but instead they put through these liberalization kind of, proposals in a very authoritarian manner rather than letting it stand up to debate.
It's the paradox, of course. Yeah, you have
Yes.
free marketeers who are sort of, pushing an authoritarian way. But of course, people would say, maybe that's not such a paradox. It's a paradox theoretically, but not empirically, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, just because you believe in freedom doesn't mean you will act on your beliefs necessarily. Okay, well, that's super interesting. So in a minute, we will go to audience questions. So drop them in the chat if you have them. Let me know if you want to speak. I guess one last thing I might just ask is, in terms of the livelihoods of the people involved in this, the anti-farm laws that are currently going to be passed, would they move some people, would they move people out of poverty, or would they put people in poverty? Is it a mixture of both? And, could lives be lost over this? Would there be, starvation possibly in some quarters? Because I'm kind of interested about what the effect on survival would be, especially in terms of the broader, I guess India's like welfare kind of, or
Yeah.
lack of system. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and it of course links to debates that have been had in the country and outside as well over the role of the market in prosperity and poverty. So there has been some suggestion that India's sort of rapid economic growth over the last 3 decades and its ability to lift people out of poverty, even though it's been slow, but India has sort of pulled people out of poverty, has in large measure been because, well, India began to liberalize its economy in the 90s. And so free markets brought economic growth. Economic growth made money available for poverty reduction, so that sort of trickle down argument has been made to say that free market policies are good for poverty reduction. Others have argued that India is actually not reformed as much as the free marketeers would have liked. And perhaps that is the reason that the Indian state was able to pull so many people out of poverty, because it ran one of the world's largest social welfare programs. And it was badly run, very inefficient, but well, it worked, it operated, and people were sort of able to, use that to move out of poverty. Much the same debate or sort of speculation has accompanied these laws, as you can imagine. Um, I'm not of the view that the market is necessarily bad for poverty reduction. It could generate unintended outcomes for poverty reduction. I think accompanied by a robust welfare policy, markets can certainly work very well. So I suppose in that respect, I'm a good social democrat in the sense, I wouldn't want sort of the market to be totally dismissed, but I do think that welfare programs are necessary. And if you accompany these with, protective discriminations for historically oppressed communities, then you have a very solid sort of system where markets and states can work together. So I think my response to your question would be that if anyone were to argue that free market reforms were in themselves enough to pull people out of poverty, that's rubbish. Free market reforms, alongside the extension of welfare programs, or at least the maintenance of welfare programs, are key. These reforms haven't talked about dismantling any welfare programs. They've only talked about dismantling the sort of intermediaries, the middlemen, the bureaucrats, and that could release entrepreneurial sort of abilities among the farmers, and it could free them from bureaucratic shackles. But I say could, because what they could also do is expose the farmers to the vagaries of the market. It could expose them to price fluctuations, and a bad year will mean a devastating loss for farmers, those who are sort of subjected to these laws, to the markets. The actual experience from an Indian state which has brought about the reforms that this national policy suggests has not been good. It suggests that the condition of the farmers actually sort of collapsed. They weren't pushed down to poverty because of the existing welfare programs, but if they had been left on their own, then they would have certainly been pushed down to poverty. So, like I say, in and of themselves, the reforms would be a disaster. Reforms with welfare programs is probably good. No reform, well, it's safe. It won't push anyone into poverty, but it may not result in the sorts of economic growth that is, at the end of the day, necessary for an agricultural economy.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question, or did you find I was hedging my sort
No,
of?
I think that did answer it. In a way, it seems like, the clear message is reform, but, actual welfare to help people who maybe might lose out from that. And in a way, it feels like, that kind of social democratic consensus, why has that been so illusory in recent years, across the globe, when really, in a way, that especially for developing countries, that's it probably is what is needed to an extent anyhow, although there's lots of caveats.
Of course, yeah, and as I said, I mean the role of the state is you cannot exaggerate its importance. It's absolutely key. You cannot think about the state sort of totally abdicating its responsibility. And I fear a lot of those who support the reforms actually support it because they think that it will come with the state rolling back, which of course will be a disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. That would just negatively affect people's actual livelihoods in a way that wouldn't really be very beneficial to anyone. But yeah, okay, well, that's really good. So I guess we'll move on to some questions now. So again, as I said before, if anyone else has any specific ones they want to ask, drop them in the chat, or put your Zoom hand up or unmute yourself maybe. But I'm going to start with Moeen's question from earlier, which is, would you say that protest in India could be contagious in other countries across South Asia?
Well, that's always an interesting question about how contagious protests are and which protests are contagious and which ones are not. I think there is a lot to be said about how people learn from one another when it comes to protests, and I don't think we should ignore that. On this occasion, I'm not sure though how contagious the protests will be, simply because the protests are targeting or are against very specific legislations. And they have been couched against very specific policies that the government of India has tried to bring about. So I'm not sure that these protests will be contagious in a way that, say, anti-authoritarian protests might be contagious. To take an example from North Africa or West Asia, for instance. So no, I think on this occasion, I'm not sure the protests will be very contagious, I'm afraid.
So it's more of a contextual protest, I suppose.
I think it's very contextual. There may be methods that people learn from one another, but again, the issues are so different. I mean, think about India and Myanmar, for instance. They're both neighboring countries, and even as we speak, there are protests in both countries. But of course, the issues are very different. One is protesting the imposition of three specific laws. The other is protesting a coup. So of course, the issues are very different. And I don't even think they are making any reference to one another. Although thanks to social media, everyone knows that there is a protest going on in the other country. But to refer to contagion, you have to demonstrate causality, I guess. And you have to demonstrate that there is an inspiration that has been obtained, which I'm not sure one can show in this context.
Yeah, in a sense, the methods and the magnitude are more of what we get from it rather than any kind of specific, sort of spread. Okay, that's very interesting. So, okay, we haven't got any other questions as yet. So I'm going to say to everyone again, if you want to ask something, go ahead. I'm all ears. But I guess maybe slightly following on from that previous question, it would be quite interesting. Oh, actually, yes, I will go to Tom's one and then, okay.
Sure.
So the Modi government has reacted very harshly to these protests. Oh, wow, that's two. Okay, the Modi government has reacted very harshly to these protests, arresting activists such as Disha Ravi and raiding Phantom Studios. Is this a sign of increasing authoritarianism?
Absolutely. I think there's been recent reports which do these calculations, and they sort of measure freedoms across the world and measure democracies across the world. And I think they've suggested that India has rolled back on a lot of those democratic indicators. Now, I should say I don't take those measures very seriously, because they do have lots of problems in how they measure things like freedom and democracy. And they have a liberal normativity to it, which is problematic. That said, there is absolutely no doubt, and we don't need Freedom House and VDEM research institutes to tell us this. There is no doubt that there has been increasing authoritarianism in India. It has taken on an ethnic turn in recent years because of the majoritarian sort of views of the present government, which has a very specific cultural view of what it wants India to be. But even if it didn't have that, the way in which it operates, the way in which it pushes its agenda forward, the way in which it seeks to crush dissent, whether it's the environmental activists that you refer, Tom, or various other activists who it has put into prison over the last several years, definitely suggests that it's a more authoritarian government than what we've seen before. And I don't say this lightly. It is necessary for us in India to come to terms with democratic backsliding and the possibility that we may not be, as in that India may not be a democracy that we knew, and so many of us grew up in. So that's a very, very real possibility, and we don't need Freedom House and VDEM to tell us that.
Yeah, no, that's very salient. Yeah. And Moeen again mentions how it's these kind of more authoritarian kind of tendencies that have been going on haven't necessarily been seen as a big threat by, say, big tech companies like Apple and Facebook. And in a way, I guess, does that give them a free pass to keep doing this? Because
I think that's a fascinating point to pick up on, the relation between big tech and the state. So, in the United States, you had the Capitol protests, and of course, I think Twitter was it, which banned Trump from for a few hours. I mean, that is unthinkable in India. That is absolutely unthinkable for big tech to take action against the prime minister. That's absolutely unthinkable. And I think here you do see the relation between states and businesses, having a very different sort of salience in the two contexts. In India, despite all we say about economic liberalization, let's not let no one be fooled. The state is firmly in charge. Even as India liberalizes economically, the Indian state is in control of what's going on. So the state liberalizes its control on the economy because it wants to do that, not because business is more powerful. So this balance between states and businesses in India, or for that matter in China or Brazil or Turkey or elsewhere, is firmly tipped in favor of the state. Unlike in the West, where, as it is more tipped towards businesses, and Twitter's sort of ability to kick Trump out, even if it was for a couple of hours, is testimony to that. So yes, big techs or companies or corporations' inability to sort of rein in, so to speak, the state, you could say, has allowed the government a free pass. But I think that would be that's only part of the issue. I don't think, and from that, I don't think the conclusion that, oh, if only the market was really free, things would be better. It doesn't work, because that's not going to happen, because of the way in which states business relations have evolved in China, India, and elsewhere. But because the business needs the state to allow those conditions for it to operate. So I think you're absolutely right that big tech's inability to sort of say something concrete against the government is part of the problem. But the solution is not to allow big tech to have that say, because if they did, even if they did, I don't think the outcomes will be very different.
Yeah.
It's a great question to ask. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, it's so relevant to highlight the way in which sort of, yeah, and kind of some of these sort of developed kind of, I guess, rising economies like India and China, you know, they may support the free market, but the power lies with the state rather than with corporations. Yeah, and that's so different from America.
And I think it's useful to also, draw us a distinction. And we've been talking about free market all this while, of course, and we've been talking about, a pro-market orientation. But remember, these are not absolutes; these are processes. So, we talk about economic liberalism. We should probably be talking about economic liberalization to suggest the processual aspect of it. But you're absolutely right. The state is firmly in charge, and more than being pro-market, you could say it's pro-business, which means that there are specific corporate houses, specific businesses that the state favors, so to speak, and that the state is willing to allow to sort of work. The state is not under the control of the businesses, as you might argue is the case in the West. And I'm not an expert on state business relations in the West, but you could say that it's the relation is tilted in favor of the corporates. That's not the case in the BRICS economies and the other rising powers.
Yeah, in a sense, like pro business and pro market, the distinction really reveals a lot about the motivations of governments. Yeah, no, okay. And so one last question from Joe Mawa. Again, if anyone wants to add any more questions, please do. But I'll just ask Joe's question, which is, what effects did the protests have on the coronavirus situation in India?
That's a fantastic question. So the government, of course, wants us to believe that the protests led to a spike in coronavirus cases. People gather together, they don't wear masks, and even if they wear masks, it's a protest. It's not like a social gathering. So, of course, the virus would explode in India. We have no evidence to suggest that that's the case. Early on, at about this time last year, when the virus sort of, began to make its presence felt in the corridors of power in India, they had banned all sorts of protests so that there was no scope for COVID to proliferate, to increase. Then, of course, they eased down a lot of those bans because, the situation seemed to be under control. But India has seen a spike in cases recently. We have no evidence to suggest it's because of the protests, because you've had a spike in cases in regions where there were no protests. But of course, the government's favored narrative is that it's the protests that led to the rise. Whereas in fact, it's perhaps because the government took the notion of herd immunity too seriously, and it thought that, Indians were achieving herd immunity. Clearly, that's not been the case.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And maybe that leads us on a little bit to talk about, in a way, the other ways in which the government have been, spinning and briefing against the protests. So perhaps, including, I guess there's been some religious cards being played by supporters of the government in regards to this as well. So it'd be interesting to elaborate on that a little bit.
Of course, yeah. So the government, of course, is what a lot of India watchers would refer to as a Hindu nationalist government, in the sense it very clearly favors the image that India is, at the end of the day, a Hindu country. And of course, you have large religious minorities in the country. They are welcome to stay, but they are guests, or they are friends, or they are people who, well, there's a slight distinction drawn between the Hindus and the others, because the Hindus are, after all, of this land, whereas the others are not. And nobody calls for an active annihilation of religious minorities, but they would turn a blind eye when there is communal conflict, for instance. Or they would actively foment a lot of the intercommunal violence between Hindus and Muslims. And in December 2019, the Indian government passed a very controversial law, which sort of made it easier for Hindus to naturalize as citizens of India compared to Muslims. I mean, this is a very broad strokes. Anyone watching the video can pick up holes in what I've just said, and I'm quite happy to have a very extended, very, very detailed discussion of the law. But in broad bones, it was a discriminatory law which made religion the filter of citizenship. So there's of course a very, very clear tilt in towards Hindu ideas that the government has. There was a dispute over a piece of land in northern India between the Hindus and the Muslims. And in November 2019, the Supreme Court of India awarded that disputed land to the Hindus, upon which a temple was built eventually. And the Prime Minister last year in July or August actually sort of attended the consecration ceremony, the ceremony which sort of, leads to the foundation of the temple. So it's a very, very clear commitment towards Hindu ideals. It's the equivalent of Boris Johnson attending a foundation laying ceremony of a massive church that was built maybe, on a territory that was disputed with some other religious group. And I'm not sure what the equivalent in Britain would be, but it's a very clear sort of indication that the government is in favor of one religious group. Now, obviously, that has implications for a movement like the farmers' movement, which drew on people from different faiths. So you have Hindus, you have Sikh, and you have Muslim folks who are also farmers and who are part of the protests. Now, in these farmers' protests, a number of farmers tended to be of the Sikh community. And the Sikh community has a more complicated relation with the Hindus that the Muslims have, but they are a different religious community. And a number of the government supporters tried to project the Sikh participation in the farmers' movement as an anti-Hindu, anti-India sort of event. And they played up the fact that many of the Sikh farmers often protested using their religious symbols to suggest that what the farmers were trying to do was to destroy the unity of India and to destroy India, and that they were leading secessionist movements and that sort of thing. Those attempts failed because at the end of the day, the farmers and their leaders, who tended to be Hindu, said this is absolute rubbish. The Sikhs and Muslims and others are farmers first, and we are in it together. So they tried, the government tried, their supporters tried, and they failed. But I'm glad you picked this up, because this does pick up and refer to one method that is used by governments that are free market in theory, but actually sort of quite despotic, and it points to a way in which they would try and keep maintain their position. It's to sow divisions and dissensions among protesters and those who oppose them.
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. Okay, so we have two more questions that I'll go through, but this is the last call for any other chat questions. Ask them now while you can. Okay, so Joe's other question was on where do these protests leave India, especially with Western countries and also developing countries that they are trying to increase their relationships with, like Uzbekistan. So I guess India's relationships with other countries and how these protests might affect those things.
I think a lot of folks would expect that Western countries, which are beacons of freedom and democracy, would make some noise and try and say that, well, this isn't quite right, etc. But of course, historically, there's very little to suggest that the West has, in fact, done anything consequential when it comes to democracies abroad. During the Cold War era, the Western countries were notorious for trying to sort of see which side of the Cold War divide different countries were on. And if democratic governments in the so-called third world countries happened to be anti-West, it was absolutely fine to topple them. So I think the historic evidence would suggest that there isn't a lot that the West can or will do in order to promote democracy elsewhere. What they will really look out for is their own interests, and interests measured in very, very materialist terms, not ideational so much, but in terms of what's in it for the West. And remember, India has emerged as a sort of counter to China. India likes to project itself as a counter to China. For many years, it was the ideational sort of counter to China, in the sense India democratic, China authoritarian. Even though that might dissolve now as India becomes more authoritarian. But India is not likely to India has its own history of tensions with China, quite independent of the West. So I think as far as the West is concerned, India can be counted on to sort of be an ally against the West in the best of circumstances. Even if India wasn't going to be an ally of the West, India would sort of, be this kind of counterweight to China. Although we talk about the BRICS groupings often, within the BRICS, that is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa sort of grouping, India and China continue to be at loggerheads over lots of things, including a very long border they share in the Himalayas. So to answer your question, no, I don't think the West is going to be able to do anything on this matter, partly because they don't want to do anything that will upset the apple cart with India. Those Western observers who might make some noise about democracy will probably be asked to respect India's sovereignty. And India is, as you can imagine, as a post-colonial nation, quite sensitive about issues of sovereignty. And they don't like it very much when they are, when comments are made about any what they would call domestic issues. So I think by and large, Western politicians, policymakers, businesses, those who matter really are not likely to say very much about what they would call India's domestic affairs. You did have celebrities tweeting in favor of the farmers back in February. You had Greta Thunberg, you had Rihanna, you had Mia Khalifa, but it's anybody's guess which policymaker or politician actually listens to them. And while they have enormous social and symbolic capital, it's not clear what they can if anything at all, to bring about substantive change.
Yeah. So our last question is, what role can the UK government take to address this issue on the global stage? So I guess in a way that feeds quite nicely off from the previous one. So in a way, they might currently be taking a fairly neutral or non-specific line, but what should be being done by, say, our government? And is there anything we can do? Is there anything that we should do? I guess would be quite a nice one to end on.
I avoid that question like the plague because it's just so complicated to answer. So of course there is, on the one hand, the question of the question I mentioned earlier about national sovereignty. And as a former colonial power, Britain saying anything at all to India is a hot cake, hot potato, whatever. Yeah, So I think any advice that in Britain is likely to give to India will not be taken seriously, not least by the present government, which is not, which can hardly claim to be a paragon of free speech and freedom and all the other sorts of nice things that we associate with liberal democracy in Britain. So, in a way, the best thing that Britain can do actually under the present circumstances is perhaps to keep quiet, to debate the issues that have emerged in the British public sphere, in Parliament, as they did, to inform the Indian government that there is significant opinion among the Indian diaspora in Britain, which has a strong view on the farmers' protests. And that view is largely that the Indian government should be more consultative. I don't think anybody has a strong view on whether the laws should be imposed or implemented or not. What people do have a view is that the farmers should be consulted. And I think that's a reasonable thing to say. Beyond that, as a former colonial power, Britain has a rather complicated, will get embroiled in an even bigger mess than some of the other countries, which may be able to sort of advise the Indian government or tell them what to do or what not to do, but not Britain, sadly. So my answer to that question is perhaps the best thing they can do is to keep quiet.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very much yeah. No, I would agree with that. I think yeah.
I do want to say this is in no way a suggestion that human rights sort of is not important, or that sovereignty is more important than human rights. I think it's just a question of who does the talking and who does the saying. I suppose a country like South Africa telling India to sort of respect the human rights of the farmers is one thing. Britain telling India to respect the human rights of anybody is a bit tricky.
Yeah, there's a lot of hypocrisy in there that maybe, yeah.
To put it mildly, yes.
Indeed. No, context is very important.
Context is very important, and I think Britain may just make the matters worse by sort of saying anything at a time when Britain is slashing its overseas investments in research and international aid by over half, I think, or the
Wow.
figures. At a time when Britain's sort of international stock, if you will, is at an all-time low, when it's cut itself off from Europe, and one can debate till forever, whether that was a good thing or not. Really, they should just keep quiet.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Indrajit. That was incredibly insightful and loads of different areas. And yeah, I think everyone here probably has a much better knowledge about the situation, about the forces at play here. So yeah, I mean, thanks for coming, and it was great to be able to find out more about these events.
Great. No, thank you so much for having me. It's always nice to talk about these things to an audience that may not be super specialist on this matter. But I think I have shared a couple of pieces I wrote on the topic. So you're very welcome to share it around. And if you have any comments, questions, you know, do get in touch, and I'll be very happy to chat further if necessary.
Yes, absolutely. You can find those pieces on our Twitter at York PolSoc right now. And yeah, Tron, I guess you can end the recording.